Today we'll be working in my workbook called Nehemiah, Part 1, Rebuilding the Wall. I have two books on Nehemiah, and this is course Part 1. This will be covering Nehemiah 1 through 7. To give you a quick history point, and this is part of the Restoration of Israel series, uh, as far as restoring Israel, or Jerusalem, really, uh, it starts if you start with the book of Daniel, Daniel shows you at the end of his life when Cyrus makes the proclamation that the Jews can go back to rebuild Jerusalem. So actually, the um, Daniel is like pre-restoration of Israel to the start of restoration of Israel before he dies. Then you have the book of Ezra, and even though it's a book of Ezra, Ezra doesn't really show up until halfway through the book. It starts when Zerubbabel brings almost 50,000 exiles back to Jerusalem through the decree from Cyrus, and he goes to rebuild the temple. And of course, there's a lot of difficulties there. You have opposition, various things. So they go back in 538 BC, and then the temple is completed finally in 515 BC. But you have the two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, during that time as well. Then the they want to start rebuilding the wall, but that gets stopped by their neighbors who are able to send a letter through and it gets stopped. So the first part of Ezra, then you have the story of Esther. Esther actually splits the two Ezra into two parts. The story of Esther. Esther's in Persia in the citadel of Susa, and her king that she marries is Xerxes. So you see up on top Cyrus through Darius, all those things. But then Xerxes is during Esther's time. Then you come back to the book of Ezra, the balance of Ezra, and it's the second return. This is when Ezra actually shows up and he goes to beautify the temple and to reform the people. And he has a number of reforms he tries to do. And that's in 458 BC. Now, at 444 BC is now where Nehemiah is going to come. And he is now going to be the builder of the walls that have been in shambles up to this time. So let's take a look at the table of contents. The first chapter we're going to do is Nehemiah's prayer. Nehemiah's prayer, Nehemiah 1 to 11a. Now the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. So this is Nehemiah's words. I've got here the words of Nehemiah. It's generally believed that the author of the book of Nehemiah is Ezra. Now, if you read the book of Ezra and you read the book of Nehemiah, they're written a little differently. And the second sentence here tells you why. The phrase, the words of Nehemiah, is interpreted to mean from his journal. So Ezra basically took his words and then maybe supplemented it with certain things. We don't know. Who is Hakaliah? We know nothing about Nehemiah's father other than what is written here. What do we know about Nehemiah? He was cupbearer, as we will find out in this chapter, to Artaxerxes Artaxerxes I, who is the Persian king and son of Xerxes, who had married Esther, at the time when Judah had been partly repopulated by Jews released from their exile in Babylon. His father is Hakaliah. It is generally believed that he's from the tribe of Judah, both because he works in the palace of the Persian king in Susa, like Daniel, and also Jerusalem is where his ancestors are buried. And we see that in Nehemiah 2:2. What is the date? In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes I. Artaxerxes reigned from 464 to 423 BC. Therefore, the 20th year of reign would have been 444 BC. The month of Kislev corresponds to our month of November-December. Ezra has gone to Jerusalem in the third year of Artaxerxes' reign to reform the exiles who moved there. So, get some here. So Ezra had gone there at the third year, And we're going to find out when this is. And I'm going to try to find my thing. Anyway, I'm looking for something while doing this here. It's always a bad thing to do. There it is. Anyway, uh, okay, what has happened up to this point regarding the restoration of Israel? I basically told you that after 70 years of captivity, Zerubbabel led 50,000 Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple around 538 BC. The rebuilding of the temple eventually is stopped by its neighbors and then is finished by 515 BC. The story of Esther happens around 483 BC. There's a period of reformation in around Jerusalem, led by Ezra around 458 BC. Now, Nehemiah will go to Jerusalem in 444 BC. So that gives you a little history. Nehemiah 1:2. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. So Hanani, Hanani. Okay, we'll do Hanani. Um, is an actual brother, Nehemiah, and apparently he has the ability to travel. And so he's been to Jerusalem and to Judah, and Nehemiah probably may not have ever gone to Jerusalem because he works in the temple, and of course he was born in captivity as his brother was, and so he may not have actually seen Jerusalem before he makes the trip there. Who is Hanani in the relationship to Nehemiah? His brother. Hanani either goes with Nehemiah back to Jerusalem or follows soon after, as Nehemiah will put him in charge, together with a man named Hanani of Jerusalem after the wall is built. Okay, Hanani, and Hananiah. Hanani and Hananiah. Okay. Where did Hanani come from? He came from Judah. We know it will take about 2 to 4 months to travel from Jerusalem to Susa, based on Ezra 7:9 and the mode of transportation. What two things did Nehemiah ask Hanani about? About the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about the city of Jerusalem. Nehemiah was born in captivity, that is, a Jew in Babylon, and probably has never seen Jerusalem. The Jewish remnant that survived the exile basically means the Jews who returned to Jerusalem from their exile in Babylon. Nehemiah 1:3. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. How are the Jews that returned to Jerusalem from Babylon? They are in great trouble and disgrace. What is the big problem with Jerusalem? The walls of Jerusalem, or the wall of Jerusalem, it's just called one. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and burned with fire. It's basically in the same situation it was when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylons came through. Actually, rebuilding of the walls had started once before, and that was stopped by the neighboring people. Of course, we have that in Ezra 4:12 and 21. Why did Nehemiah respond so strongly to a town he has never seen? And so there's an opinion question. His heart is in Jerusalem. Most of the Jews' hearts are in Jerusalem and in their homeland. They have a hunger to go back. And Nehemiah apparently is being pulled by God to have this feeling for Jerusalem because God is setting him up perfectly to be the man for the season. What four things did Nehemiah do when he heard about Jerusalem? He sat down and wept. He mourned, fasted, and prayed. It's much like what we should do when we see things that are a problem. Point to consider, after the enemies of the Jews had successfully stopped the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem between 13 to 20 years prior, we can now look back and see that God has a special man that he wanted in charge of the rebuilding of the walls. How did God prepare Nehemiah for the job? First, Nehemiah has a heart for Jerusalem. Secondly, he has personal access to the king. We will see other traits indicating why God chose Nehemiah for this job. we will also see God's perfect timing. So when we look at Nehemiah and look at how he approaches these things, we have to see that sometimes a man is or a woman is especially designed for a job that God has designed for them. So sometimes when something is stopped and we think it should go on by God, it may be that he has a particular person in mind to do it. So, keep that in mind when you feel like things have stopped for no good reason um, by God. So, and we see that even today, I think. Nehemiah 1:5. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. Now, Nehemiah's great prayer has 7 elements that we should model when we pray. One of the elements is always first in any prayer should be praise to God. Number one, let's see, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his commandments of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Keep his covenant of love for those with those who love him and keep his commandments. So that, he is then praising God. That's what we should always start our prayers with. Where is Nehemiah again? He is in Babylon, probably in the citadel of Susa, actually. The Jews are in exile in Babylon because they followed other gods, and yet Nehemiah is praising his God for his love. How do you explain this praise of Nehemiah? Well, even in our worst situations, if we believe in God, we can see God's hand in things. And in his case, he is in the palace of the king. He has a good job. He is well taken care of. He has a lot of benefits to him, even though he's a captive in Babylon. Then the next thing you need to do in your prayers is a petition and repetition for the help we're hoping for. Neo asks both for God's ear to be attentive and for God's eyes to be open to hear his prayer. So he's now saying, listen, God, please listen to me. Please hear my prayer. Please see what's going on. How often is Nehemiah praying for the people of Israel? Day and night. Nehemiah 1:6b. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. So now we need to always confess our sins and be honest with God. What sins did Nehemiah confess? We have not obeyed the decrees, laws, and commands that you have given your servant Moses. Did he include himself in these sins that were done? Yes. Looking at 2 Kings 17, 7 through 8 below, what was the major sin that the Israelites did that caused their captivity by another nation? So what were the sins this Israelites committed against God, which led to their captivity? 2 Kings 17, 7 through 8. All this took place, the captivity of the Israelites, because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the king of Israel had introduced. So basically, their biggest sin was their idolatry. Initially, we think of the sins the Jews did that caused them to be put into exile. But now that they have lived over 70 years in a foreign land with foreign customs, do you think there are other sins against God that could have committed during their captivity? Yes. What could they be? Well, basically, intermarrying, still worshiping the gods of Babylon, straying away from their love of God and doing some of the activities and rituals that have to do with the kingdom that they're under. Nehemiah 1:8. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, Then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Notice name is capitalized. We can definitely remind God of his promises. God promised the Israelites that if they were unfaithful, what would happen? That they would be scattered among the nations. God also promised that if the Israelites returned to him and obeyed his commands, what would happen? That even if your exiled people are from the farthest horizon, I will gather them and bring them back to Israel. And 3, I will gather them from there and bring them to a place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Look at the scripture below. What place is the dwelling that God is talking about in verse 9? 2 Chronicles 7:16. God tells Solomon when the temple was finished, I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. So it's the temple. Therefore, what city is the place? Jerusalem. How many Jews need to obey God's commands in order for him to gather the exile? All of them. Or at least most of them, really, if you think about it. No, you never can get a full consensus, but if most people are praying and on their knees, then God will hear. Nehemiah 1:10. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this, your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man being the king. Lastly, we see humility, the final plea, and the big finish. The word redeemed means gain possession of something in exchange for payment. How did God redeem us and from whom? Well, from whom is always Satan. He redeemed us by the payment of Jesus' blood. According to Nehemiah, is he the only one who is praying about the restoration of Israel? No. And to the prayers of your servants. So he isn't the only one praying for the restoration of Israel. What does Nehemiah want God to give him specifically? Success by granting him favor in the presence of the king. In presence of this man, Nehemiah is talking about the king. If Nehemiah is to do anything himself for Jerusalem, he needs to get permission from the king. What do you think Nehemiah wants to ask the king? To help Jerusalem in some way to rebuild the walls, either by him doing it or by him sending forces to do it, whatever. He wants the king's help in it. Reread Nehemiah 1:4 again. Nehemiah didn't just pray once and then consider the situation covered, but he mourned, prayed, and fasted for several days. His heart is burdened with the problems of Jerusalem. Therefore, he wants to do something. Do you think this is how God calls us to action, to give us a burden to resolve an issue? Yes. Have you ever felt this burden? Um, I have a burden to write books, as you can tell. Uh, but it could be a burden on anything. But for me, I can't stop writing books, as you may have seen. I write for a year, and that is what God has called me to do. And thankfully, I have YouTube to be able to put them out, although I teach them. And so, if you're ever interested in teaching, just write to me. Anyway, enough of me. Okay, so here's the crossword. And I get my password out here just in case there's a question I don't quite remember. Specifically, Nehemiah is asking God for success when he talks with the king. Another name for dwelling for my name, temple. 7, what king does he serve? Artaxerxes. And 9, who is Nehemiah's brother? Hanani. 1, what is Nehemiah's job? Bearer. 2, due to the burden Nehemiah feels, he prays or prayed to God. Who is Nehemiah's father? Hakaliah. The major sin the Israelites did against God was to worship other gods. Yeah. What had been broken down and burned with fire? the wall. So that's the end of this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.